And the Veterans Day edition of the lectures report tonight. With the surrender of Japan in September 1945, decades of Japanese colonial rule in Korea came to an end. The Korean Peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel, with the North under communist rule and allied with the Soviet Union, and the South allied with the United States. The communists would come to power in China in October of 1949, and in June 1950, the North invaded the South in an effort to forcibly reunite the country. In August of 1950, the United Nations coalition led by the United States sent troops into Korea to repel the invasion. By October, the Allied forces had penetrated deep into the North, and it appeared that the war would soon end. However, in early November, the weather turned bitterly cold. Trucks would often not start, or they couldn't make it over the mountain passes. It became difficult to maintain supply lines, and our forces faced shortages of food and munitions. Medical corpsmen had to actually take ampoules of morphine and stuff them into their cheeks, walk around like chipmunks to keep them warm, because otherwise they would freeze, and then they couldn't be used when they were needed. And the Chinese began sending troops across the Yalu River into Korea. The U.S. knew this, but underestimated their numbers, a failure that would soon become manifest at the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, major engagements of conflict. The Marines in Korea were hastily reorganized early in the conflict, and many of the Marines found themselves being sent on missions with men they barely knew or were meeting for the first time. Against this backdrop, a group of Marines went out on patrol, keeping a watchful eye out for Chinese soldiers who had crossed the border. A young Marine named Michael had the point. A short time into the patrol, he was joined by another Marine also named Michael. The two had not met before. A snow squall kicked up. The visibility declined to the point where two Marines could no longer see the rest of the patrol. A minute or two later, the squall subsided, and the two Marines discovered that they had walked into an ambush. 7 Chinese soldiers opened fire. The first Michael was hit. He collapsed, and as he lay bleeding in the snow, he looked up and watched as the second Michael was transformed into a magnificent being of light. The rest of the patrol quickly caught up with the badly wounded Michael. He asked after the second Michael and was informed that there was no other Michael, that he had been walking alone. The other men in the patrol had many questions. All 7 Chinese soldiers were dead, and it appeared that they had died from a bayonet, perhaps a sword. Michael could only offer that he had been saved by another Marine. Michael had been named for St Michael the Archangel. He grew up with a special devotion to St Michael and was in the habit of reciting an old prayer each morning. Michael, Michael of the morning, fresh cord of heaven adorning, keep me safe today, and in time of temptation, drive the devil away. While convalescing, Michael wrote a letter to his mother describing his experience. On the hospital ship that carried him back to San Diego, he was visited by a priest, a named chaplain. Michael allowed the chaplain to make a copy of his letter, which the priest subsequently read to a group of new recruits at the San Diego Naval Yard. This brought the letter to the attention of a news producer named Ed Hardy. Ed Hardy tracked down the chaplain and recorded him reading the letter. Ed Hardy later moved on to a Detroit area radio station, and it became something of a Christmas Eve tradition in the 60s to play the recording of the priest reading Michael's letter on the Lee Allen show. Michael never wanted this letter to become public, and in the years since, errors have crept into the story as it's been retold many times. That's particularly accelerated in the age of the internet. For example, the name of the chaplain is variously given as Mulder, Moldy, Miller, and a half dozen other variations. I have done a lot of research on this story. I probably have done a deeper dive into this than anybody alive today. And I'm 98% certain that I have identified the priest. I actually managed to speak to another priest who knew him. I've corresponded with Lee Allen. I verified that Michael the Marine was living in Fort Wayne in 1964. So while the internet is certainly full of apocryphal stories and urban legends, I believe that this basic story here is true. I'll read you the letter. This is what he wrote to his mom as he was recovering in the hospital. Dear Mom, I wouldn't dare to write this letter to anyone but you, because no one else would believe it. Maybe even you will find it hard to believe, but I've got to tell somebody. First off, I'm in the hospital. Now don't worry. Hear me? Don't worry. I was wounded, but I'm okay. You understand? Okay. The doctor says I'll be up and around in a month. But that's not what I want to tell you. Remember when I joined the Marines last year? Remember when I left? How you told me to say a prayer to St. Michael every day? You really didn't have to tell me that. Ever since I can remember, you always told me to pray to St. Michael the Archangel. You even named me after him. Well, I always have. When I got to Korea, I prayed even harder. Remember that prayer you taught me? Michael, Michael in the morning, fresh port of heaven in morning. You know the rest of it. Well, I said it every day. Sometimes when I was marching or sometimes resting, but always before I went to sleep. I even got some of the other fellows to say it. Well, one day I was with an advanced detail up over the front lines. We were scouting for the commies. I was plodding along in the bitter cold. My breath was like cigar smoke. I thought I knew every guy in the patrol. Then alongside of me comes another Marine I'd never met before. He was bigger than any other Marine I'd ever seen. He must have been 6'4", built in proportion. Gave me a feeling of security to have such a body near. Anyway, there we were, trudging along. The rest of the patrol spread out. Just to start a conversation, I said, "Cold, ain't it?" And then I laughed. Here I was with a good chance of getting killed any minute, but I'm talking about the weather. My companion seemed to understand. I heard him laugh softly. I looked at him. I've never seen you before, I thought. I knew every man in the outfit. I just joined at the last minute, he replied. The name is Michael. Is that so? I said, surprised. That's my name, too. I know, he said. Then he went on, Michael, Michael of the morning. I was too amazed to say anything for a minute. How did he know my name? The prayer that you had taught me. Then I smiled to myself. Every guy in the outfit knew about me. Hadn't I taught that prayer to anyone who would listen? Why, now and then they even referred to me as St. Michael. Neither of us spoke for a time, and then he broke the silence. We're going to have some trouble up ahead. He must have been in fine physical shape, or he was breathing so lightly I couldn't see his breath. Mine poured out in great clouds. There was no smile on his face now. Trouble ahead, I thought to myself. Well, with the commies all around us, that's no great revelation. Snow began to fall in great thick globs. In a brief moment, the whole countryside was blotted out. And I was marching in a white fog, wet, sticky particles. My companion disappeared. Michael, I shouted in sudden alarm. I felt his hand on my arm. His voice was rich and strong. This will stop shortly. His prophecy proved to be correct. In a few minutes, the snow stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The sun was a hard, shining disk. I looked back to the rest of the patrol. There was no one in sight. We had lost them in the heavy snowfall. I looked ahead as we came over to a rise. Mom, my heart stopped. There were 7 of them. 7 commies in their padded pants and jackets and funny hats. Only there wasn't anything funny about them now. 7 rifles were aimed at us. Down, Michael, I screamed, and I hit the frozen earth. I heard those rifles fire almost as one. I heard the bullets. There was Michael still standing. Mom, those guys couldn't have missed, not at that range. I expected to see him burn together with this. But there he stood, making no effort to fire at himself. He was paralyzed with fear. It happens sometimes. Mom, even to the bravest. like a bird fascinated by a snake. At least that's what I thought then. I jumped up to pull him down, and that's when I got mine. I felt a sudden flame in my chest. I often wondered what it felt like to be hit. Now I know. I remember feeling strong arms about me, arms that laid me down so gently, ever so gently on a pillow of snow. I opened my eyes for one last look. I was dying. Maybe I was even dead. I remember thinking, well, this is not so bad. Maybe I was looking into the sun. Maybe I was in shock. But I saw Michael standing erect again, only this time his face was shining with a terrible splendor. As I say, maybe it was the sun in my eyes, but he seemed to change as I watched him. He grew bigger, his arms stretched out wide. Maybe it was the snow falling again, but there was a brightness around him like the wings of an angel. And in his hand, a sword. Well, that's the last thing I remember until the rest of the fellows came up and found me. I don't know how much time passed. Now and then I've had but a moment's rest from the pain and fever. I remember telling them of the enemy just ahead. Where's Michael? I asked. I saw them look at one another. Where's who? Asked one. Michael. Michael, that big Marine I was walking with just before the snow squall hit us. Kid, said the sergeant, you weren't walking with anyone. I had my eyes on you the whole time. We were getting too far out. I was about to call to you when you disappeared into the snow. He looked at me curiously. How did you do it, kid? How'd I do what? I asked, half angry despite my wound. The Marine named Michael and I were, son, the sergeant interrupted. I picked this outfit myself, and there just ain't another Michael in it. You're the only Mike. He paused for a minute. So just how did you do it? We heard the shots. There hasn't been a shot fired from your rifle. And there isn't a bit of lead in them 7 bodies over there. I didn't say anything. What could I say? I could only look open-mouthed with amazement. It was then that the sergeant spoke again. Kid, every one of those commies was killed by the stroke of a sword. That's all I can tell you, Miles. As I say, maybe it was the sun in my eyes, the pain and the cold, but that's what happened. Love, Mike. The audio is poor, but if you go to YouTube and just search "A Letter from Michael, Korea, 1950," you can find an old broadcast of the Lee Allen show that has the original recording of the priest reading the letter that I just read to you. So, as we reflect on our servicemen and women this evening, had a special request for this particular presentation. Thank you.